The morning began with fanfare. Glass doors slid open as a stream of polished shoes and curated outfits passed through the hotel atrium. The conference name, embossed in white on black banners, hung like a seal of entry above a crowd that already believed it belonged. The event was curated, exclusive, for thought leaders only, as the invitation had so proudly claimed. Inside, lanyards clicked over blazers, phones buzzed with schedule alerts, and cappuccino foam curled beneath designer logos. Everyone seemed to know someone. Elbows brushed like backroom handshakes, eye contact was a currency. In every corner, small huddles gathered, tight smiles, firm nods, LinkedIn scans. And then he arrived. No one noticed. He came alone, walking with steady, unhurried steps. His suit was not custom but pressed. His shoes carried no gloss, but the creases spoke of ground covered. A leather folder tucked beneath his arm held more weight than it revealed. He approached the check-in desk. The assistant behind the table didn't look up at first. She was still mid-scroll through the digital guest list, one eye on her screen, the other on the VIP lane. When she finally lifted her gaze, it was automatic, trained to filter. He didn't have the look. No branded tote bag, no event badge, no sticker from the pre-check-in lounge. Her eyes narrowed with protocol. The words came rehearsed. Condescension cloaked in professional courtesy. She asked for his name, then for proof of registration. Her tone softened just slightly when he showed her the invitation, but only for a second, until another coordinator walked over, this one louder, performative, already calculating who could be seen standing near whom. The moment turned. They told him the keynote speaker wouldn't be here for hours, that the doors were restricted until then. That credentials were necessary. That maybe he should return when general access opened. The implication was clear: leave. He stepped aside. He didn't argue. He found a bench along the perimeter of the foyer near the glass wall that overlooked the garden. And he sat. The city moved beyond the window. Inside, the event buzzed with intention. Early panelists rehearsed jokes in the mirror. Tech founders adjusted their watches just before entering the elevator. Even the staff moved like they belonged to something bigger than the man quietly seated near the wall. He watched it all. The way conversations shifted when cameras passed. The way greetings were proportioned, longer for money, shorter for the hungry. He saw the mechanics of validation. The way people clung to credibility like it had an expiration date. The irony wasn't lost on him. Years ago, this very event hadn't existed. He'd pitched its skeleton in a pitch deck nobody had time to read. The original idea wasn't about access or optics, it was about hard-won knowledge being shared by people who had bled for it. But as the idea scaled, so did the distance between truth and stage. They bought him out quietly. Called it strategic consolidation. Now here he was, back in the place that wore the skin of his vision but none of its soul. He watched the stage being tested. Watched sound engineers clip microphones to lapels. Watched interns run cables while executives rehearsed candor. And through it all, he waited. The folder on his lap hadn't moved. At 9:15, they started seating VIPs. He remained where he was. At 9:45, someone noticed him again, a junior coordinator, clipboard in hand, lips moving too quickly for her eyes to follow. She whispered to a colleague. Then someone else approached. He stood before they could finish their question, walked past them, and entered through the side door. He stepped onto the backstage platform as the lights dimmed and the opening speaker gave the scripted welcome. His folder remained closed. His hands relaxed at his sides. He looked calm. Because this was never about crashing their party. It was about reclaiming the room he had built, brick by invisible brick. The house lights dimmed as the first presenter wrapped up his well-rehearsed introduction. Polite applause rolled across the seated crowd like a signal. Not a celebration, a social cue that one segment had ended and something else was about to begin. The screen behind the stage flickered, the logo of the conference rippling across black glass, accompanied by ambient synths meant to evoke innovation. Then a name appeared. Not a company. A person. Just a name, first and last, with no title beneath it. It wasn't familiar. Whispers stirred. Those in the front row glanced at one another, confused. Heads turned toward the wings, anticipating a well-known founder, or a famous investor, or perhaps a disruptor with a bestseller and a TED Talk under their belt. But none appeared. Until he did. He stepped into the spotlight with a slow, unhurried gait, the same one he used walking down subway stairs or carrying his groceries home. No music. No fanfare. Just footsteps against the hardwood stage. A few people blinked in recognition, faint memories surfacing. His name had circulated years ago. Attached to an early idea. A small funding round. A disappearing exit. Some said he'd been bought out. Others said he walked away. He didn't speak at first. He placed the leather folder on the podium, opened it, pulled out a single page, and then he looked up. The silence became heavy, intentional, the kind of pause that makes people forget how to hold their phones steady. There was no clicker in his hand, no slide deck behind him, just words waiting to be spoken. And when he began, the room changed. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried with it the weight of someone who had done more than just pitch, someone who had failed without excuse, rebuilt without applause, and endured without spotlight. He didn't talk about disruption. He talked about survival. He didn't sell a vision. He described a war of belief, of dignity, of choosing to keep working long after the room stopped clapping. He told the story of building a product with no funding, scaling it with strangers who became family, and watching it grow into something that was quietly stripped from his hands. Not with malice, with formality. The kind that disguises erasure as business. And then he paused again. This time longer. Letting the truth fill the corners of the auditorium, brushing up against the ego of every overconfident founder in the second row. He didn't accuse anyone by name. He didn't need to. Because the people who had overlooked him were sitting in the front. And the people who had lived like him, the overlooked, the undercredentialed, the self-taught, were scattered across the crowd, their faces slowly shifting from disbelief to something deeper. Recognition. The hosts backstage watched with unease. He hadn't sent slides in advance. Hadn't confirmed key talking points. This wasn't the planned message. This wasn't part of the brand narrative. And yet, the audience didn't move. Phones stayed down. I stayed up. Because what he was delivering wasn't a keynote. It was a reckoning. He ended with no catchphrase, no hashtag, no standing ovation request. Just a final line. You cannot uninvite someone from the space they created. You can only forget long enough to be reminded. Then he stepped down. The room didn't applaud right away. Not because it didn't want to, because it forgot how. It had never heard truth delivered with no agenda before. He walked past the velvet ropes, through the crowd, down the same hall where just hours earlier he'd been told to leave. This time, no one blocked his path. Some tried to speak, but the words caught on their own guilt. He didn't wait for redemption. He wasn't there for revenge. He was there to remind them that a name isn't made by the people who say it loudest. It's made by the ones who keep working long after no one says it at all. The video clip went viral before lunch. A shaky recording posted by someone in the third row captured the quiet power of his final sentence. Within hours, it had been clipped, subtitled, reshared with headlines like, "The keynote no one saw coming and when the creator returns." But by then, he was already gone. He hadn't stayed for the panel discussion. He hadn't posed for photos. He hadn't left a social handle. He exited the same way he arrived, unnoticed by the organizers, unseen by the press, unbothered by applause. Outside the venue, the world went on. Taxis honking, coffee cups steaming in cold hands, subway entrances swallowing crowds. He melted into it, comfortable in the anonymity. But inside the building, something had shifted. The next speaker stood awkwardly at the podium, attempting to follow what couldn't be followed. Their polished presentation suddenly felt brittle, their motivational tone artificial, like wrapping paper over an empty box. Eyes wandered, phones scrolled. The energy was gone. Backstage, the event team scrambled. They whispered about how no one had approved his message, how the keynote wasn't supposed to be so personal. But deeper down, even they knew it had been more honest than anything the stage had seen in years. Meanwhile, in corridors and hotel lobbies, the real conversation began. A woman from a nonprofit approached the catering staff, asking their names for the first time. A junior developer texted a screenshot of his keynote to her old mentor. "This is what I meant when I said they didn't see us." One of the panel moderators quietly stepped away from his schedule, sat alone, and stared at the conference badge around his neck as if it no longer belonged. In the corner of the venue cafe, a man who had once competed with the keynote speaker years ago, in a funding round neither of them had won, stared at the live stream replay, pausing every few seconds. He recognized the voice. He remembered the work. And now he remembered the silence that followed. How that voice disappeared after acquisition. How his name slowly vanished from product pages, from history. He remembered not saying anything back then. Now it was too late. The speaker's phone remained off for the rest of the day. He didn't check notifications. He didn't refresh feeds. He sat at a small diner 2 blocks from the venue, one that hadn't changed in a decade. stirring his coffee until it cooled, watching condensation form on the glass window beside him. He didn't need to know what the world was saying. He had already said what mattered. Later, he pulled a notebook from his coat pocket and began writing. Not about the event, but about the people he saw there. Their eyes, their posture, the way some shrank when dismissed, and the way others expanded when given truth. He wrote names he didn't know, just to remember what they looked like. He wasn't done speaking. He was just beginning to choose where he spoke next. That night, the organizer of the event posted a photo of the stage, captioned vaguely, "This is what real leadership looks like." Comments poured in. Some praised, some questioned. Others shared their own stories of being overlooked, passed by, uninvited. No one knew the full story, but they felt it. The keynote had not been about him. It had been about everyone who had ever been told to wait outside. Everyone who had ever been asked for credentials instead of experience. Everyone who had ever been mistaken for irrelevant because they didn't come with a spotlight. And as the day ended and the lights inside the venue dimmed once more, the stage stood empty, but it felt different. Not because someone had filled it, because someone had reclaimed it. The conference ended the next day, but the echo of his words didn't. Attendees left with tote bags full of brochures and branded pens, but it wasn't the giveaways they discussed in airport lounges and rideshares. It was him. The man who wasn't listed in the app. The man who wasn't seated at the VIP table. The man who made them feel something they didn't have a name for. By Monday, internal Slack channels at companies large and small were lit with clipped phrases from his speech. People who'd never stayed past 5 began talking about building for impact. Junior staff forwarded links to managers with the subject line, "Worth watching." One company even canceled a planned reorg meeting to hold a team discussion on culture. They didn't say it was because of him, but it was. He stayed away from the noise. No press. No follow-ups. No explanations. Instead, he returned to work. Not a startup this time, not something to be acquired, not something to scale, not something anyone could quietly steal. He walked into a small community space tucked between 2 hardware stores, a space he'd been funding quietly for years. It had no reception desk, no mission statement on the wall, but every week people came. Coders without degrees, veterans with startup ideas, teenagers with notebooks full of half-built worlds, single parents with a product sketch and no roadmap. They called it a lab, but it wasn't about technology. It was about giving people room to try without being laughed out of the room. That morning, he brewed coffee for everyone, wrote 3 names on the chalkboard, and asked what they wanted to build. He didn't mention the keynote. No one asked. Not because they didn't know, because they understood that the man who showed up there was the same man who stood here now. Later that week, an envelope arrived. Official. Embossed. An invitation to speak at a private founders summit in Switzerland, first-class ticket included, luxury accommodations promised. The letter called him a voice of disruptive truth. It praised his clarity, his bravery. He placed the envelope aside. Didn't open the second page. At the same moment, a young woman across town emailed him. She had been at the conference. Sat in the last row. No badge. No job title. No credentials. She had come on a student pass and left changed. Her message was simple. She didn't ask for mentorship. She asked for space. He replied an hour later. Gave her the address to the lab. Told her when to come. Told her she wouldn't need to impress anyone. She arrived early the next day. He was already sweeping the front steps. They worked side by side, not saying much, just building. A whiteboard filled with scribbles. Coffee cups left half full. Moments that looked unremarkable from the outside. But those were the kinds of moments his life had been made of. Quiet ones. Untelevised. Unphotographed. Real ones. Back at the conference venue, weeks later, a committee held a meeting about next year's program. They argued about speakers, themes, how to recapture that energy from the previous keynote. One suggested reaching out to him again. Another said it would be good for PR. They never found him. Not because he disappeared. Because he was busy doing the work they only talked about. He hadn't become a symbol. He had remained a builder. And builders don't need to be invited to prove they belong. They just show up. And change the room by existing inside it. Autumn came quietly with golden leaves caught in sidewalk gutters and a gentler kind of light cutting between buildings. In the city's usual rush, it went unnoticed. But at the lab, the space tucked between the hardware stores, the season brought clarity. He kept showing up every day before the lights turned on. He swept the floor, replaced the old light bulbs himself, tightened the legs of the table no one else realized wobbled. Nothing glamorous, nothing documented, just the invisible labor that holds everything together. By now, the room was full most nights. People didn't call it a co-working space. It didn't need a name. It had become something different, not a place to work, but a place to believe. The kind of belief that comes when you're finally seen without having to perform. He watched from the edge, not from above. He sat beside them. Sometimes he reviewed a pitch deck. Sometimes he listened to someone explain a half-formed idea they were afraid to say out loud. Other times he said nothing at all, just passed someone a marker or a charger or a clean sheet of paper when they needed it most. Word had spread. Not in headlines. In whispers. One person told two. Two told five. But they were careful not to spoil it, not to crowd it, not to let it become something that would be co-opted. Because they understood something rare was happening. And he wasn't chasing growth. He was protecting something sacred. Meanwhile, outside the walls, the industry tried to catch up. New conferences launched with new slogans. Brochures promised authenticity and real stories. PR teams hunted for underdogs they could turn into content. But none of them found what they were looking for because what he had offered on that stage wasn't brandyable. It was human. He had become a myth in rooms he would never enter again. Investors asked about him in meetings. Founders told versions of his story with varying details, all slightly rewritten to center themselves. Some even claimed they knew him, had mentored with him, sat with him once in a cafe. But the truth didn't need defending. Because the people who mattered knew where he really was. One evening, the lab stayed open late. A group of students had taken over the back table, trying to figure out how to pitch an idea about equitable housing tech. They were nervous, stumbling. One of them looked over at him, asking without asking. He sat with them for 2 hours. Not giving answers. Giving questions. Letting them arrive at their own voice. After they left, he remained. Alone in the darkening room, sitting beneath the whiteboard now stained with a dozen days' worth of marker ghosts. He looked tired, but not defeated. Outside, it had started to rain. He stepped into it without an umbrella, walking slowly through the drizzle as the city hummed around him. He passed the glowing towers where some of his old peers still played at being gods. Past billboards with logos that had once used his code base, his language, his ideas, their faces scrubbed of origin. He let it go. Because he had built something bigger now. Not on a stage. Not in a cloud server. But in a room with no name, filled with people who had never been invited anywhere before and who now knew they didn't need permission to take up space. He had shown them how. By walking through the door they tried to close in his face. And staying. Winter arrived with fewer warnings than expected. Snow dusted the window frames of the lab, softening the edges of a city that rarely slowed. The cold outside sharpened the quiet inside as muffled footsteps crossed the linoleum floor and jackets were hung carefully by the door. There was no official closure for the holidays, no email announcement, no calendar block. But the space stayed open always. He came in early, as usual. No one saw him enter. No one ever really did. He replaced the air filter in the ceiling vent. Refilled the tea canister. Left fresh pens by the whiteboard. These things mattered not because anyone asked for them, but because he remembered a time when he worked in places where no one thought to care for the details. Where the lights flickered, the bathrooms stayed broken, and no one ever fixed the chair with the one short leg. But here, people noticed. And they remembered. Not with words. With how they treated the space. Shoes stayed by the mat. Coffee was brewed and shared without ask. Laptops were closed when someone needed to speak. A different kind of ecosystem. Built on presence instead of performance. That afternoon, a woman arrived with a canvas bag of notebooks. She'd been coming for months, always sitting in the same corner, always leaving before anyone could ask her what she was building. Today was different. She brought her project forward. She unfolded a plan on the table, ink bleeding across lined paper and corners softened by time. She was nervous. He stood beside her, not to direct, but to witness. She spoke. Slowly. Then faster. Then with conviction. By the end, the room applauded. Not out of pity. Out of recognition. Later, someone turned to him and asked how he knew who to give space to. He didn't answer. Because the question was wrong. He hadn't given them space. He'd only made sure it stayed open. That night, as the city shimmered under frozen street lamps, a delivery was left at the front of the building. A package. Unmarked. Inside, a printed program from a conference taking place overseas. The keynote slot was blank. A sticky note rested on the cover. It read, "Would you consider returning?" He closed the folder, left it on the windowsill. He no longer needed a stage. His stage was here in the silence between ideas. In the crackle of cheap radiators warming rooms full of hope, in the nods exchanged between people who once believed they had no voice. He stayed late, swept the floor one more time, turned out the lights, and as he stepped outside, snowflakes caught on the cuff of his coat, the air crisp with beginning. He looked out at the city. It had forgotten who built what, but the people in that room never would. Because in a world obsessed with arrival, he'd chosen to stay. And sometimes the most powerful story isn't told into a microphone. It's written in the quiet work of showing up again, and again, and again.